I wanted to start by asking each of you how you look back on it, including if you've seen it or when you last saw it. Michael first.
Well, I have to say, a horrible thing to say, I've never really seen it. I've been too frightened to see it. I didn't know what was going to happen, but my memories of it are great. I loved it. I was frightened all the time of being told off or not doing something right. The first half is all out in London, all those scenes in the street, and then we all go inside. And then my memories of those two big blocks and trying to get things right, trying to make people happy, and failing most of the time. But I loved it.
Janet, what about for you? And have you seen it?
I've been sitting secretly at the back for the last hour, and I got astonished all over again. I'd sort of forgotten how extraordinary a piece of writing it is. It's a piece of television. I could remember more dimly than most my own bits, I have to say, because I think what happens is that you get so terrified and you're so doing your little bit of job, as it were, that everything else is a haze. But I do remember the wonderful Joanna the nurse.
Oh, she was beautiful.
She was just so spot on. And Leslie French and all those wonderful actors in their terrible beds and their terrible illnesses. Those segues from imagination to reality and everything, just were completely stunning. But it has to be said that you look upon yourself in the third person. It's her. I don't feel me anymore. It's quite an odd sensation I think actors have when they watch them.
Yeah, it's someone else.
Someone else. Yeah.
Kenneth, what about you and then Jon as well, as the people who had to make it come alive?
I mean, I can't swear to you that I've recently seen it in full. Even today, I didn't have the ease or concentration not to run about the place and find out who's here and who isn't here. But at the same time, I think it's under my skin, to use a phrase relevant to the piece, and it never leaves me. And every time I return to it in some form or other, I discover something rich or something disturbing, and I have the chronic producer's itch, which you sit there thinking, oh, why didn't we cut that? And why can't we go back and put something extra there, which is all nonsense. But it's so powerful and so pervasive that, in a way, I live with it.
What about for you, Jon? Have you watched it again since you made it?
Yes, the last time I saw it was actually, I think with you, Ken, when you and I did the commentary.
That commentary, yeah.
Yes. I had seen it at an all-day screening at the Public Theatre in New York. Joe Papp screened it as an all-day thing. And so all my anxieties, I think, of, oh God, is this going to look horribly small? Is it going to look like it was just made for a small screen? All of those evaporated, I have to say, because it seemed to me at least to hold up rather well on the big screen, given how much technology, styles, and all other fashions have changed in the making of television. I was pleasantly surprised. As somebody who makes television quite a lot these days, most of the time you find yourself thinking, how do I make this work? How do I lift this from at least a sort of B to a B plus or a B plus to an A minus? This was the only script I've ever received where I sat and I thought, and forgive my language, how the do I ever live up to this screenplay? And when I looked at it, I thought, all right. I thought we didn't let Dennis down. I really felt that. I felt all of us did him proud, and that's a good feeling.
Am I right in thinking there were some changes that you did bring about in the last episode in particular, Jon?
Yeah, yes. Despite Dennis's fearsome reputation, I went in with all the sort of arrogance, I suppose, of the uninitiated, and told him all the reasons why I thought his masterpiece could actually be improved. He didn't take very kindly to it at first, but eventually he actually did everything that we talked about, which by and large were the following things. One, in the first in the first draft, he dropped the whole singing detective story after the first episode. And I told him I thought that was a mistake and a great pity, and he listened. Actually, interestingly, Janet, he did a huge amount of work on the relationship between, on his relationship with her, because, in the first instance, I felt she existed really only as a figment of his imagination and was therefore very lacking in dimension. And I wanted to care about them being together at the end. So he did a lot of work to rework that relationship. And yes, he rewrote the last episode twice, in fact, while the savage attack from that awful disease of his was an extraordinary achievement.
Do any of you each of you have a favourite scene or a particular favourite memory of the making of this?
It was just nice being in that bed and being safe.
Yes, Michael does a very, very good fart imitation, and he would lie in the bed, and at crucial moments when everybody was taking everything very seriously, there would suddenly come this sort of from Michael's bed.
I mean, as they push the trolley around the room, they push it very slowly around the room, and it takes about half an hour to get right round. And I'd wait till the last minute and then go, It sounded quite loud in that room. I only did it once.
But everyone remembers.
I mean, I remember kind of minor things, really, which is typical, I suppose. I looked out for 2 scenes which only 3 or 4 years ago, when I worked with him again, did I realise it was the young Ken Stott starring as the uncle. And the other one of my favourites, which I'm slightly ashamed of because it's very show busy, but it's also very true and has a heart, is the scene in episode 6 where Janet and Patrick Malahide have this phone call from LA and where the shitty producer betrays her entirely, but her comeback is so sterling and unanswerable that it's a tremendous.
You kill her.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think the whole thing is lovely, and there are so many gems in it that every time you go back to it, it's rich and rewarding.
Peter, what about for you? Do you have a favourite scene? And also, what's your view on it as someone who is a writer and has clearly been very influenced by Potter?
I think, my view on it is the first. I was 5 years into rejection slips when I first watched Dennis Potter. I was a teacher of children with severe learning difficulties, and it was a Sunday night haven. I felt that the Singing Detective, when I saw it from the outside as nobody who had any sort of foothold in the business, was inspirational, was speaking to a nation that at the time was incredibly fragmented, not dissimilar times to now, with a kind of hard right Tory government, but it spoke of themes and memories and sense of self, and its ambition and its the way it demanded something of the audience was incredibly inspirational, and that was before I was writing for television. As a member of that audience, you didn't feel patronised, and that's a very important part of the lesson we should learn from Potter. And then from the inside, obviously, when I came to write Blackpool and Pictures as a musical, obviously the great shadow of that work is Singing Detective, and I always consider Blackpool to be my karaoke tributes of Dennis Potter. Thematically, watching it again today, thematically, it's just extraordinary how in control he is of all those themes and all those styles, and the main thing about it is, Ken mentioned the word heart, is that you could describe it quite dryly, experimental, musical elements, genre, non-genre, but it's got a huge heart. You care deeply, and when Michael walks out of the ward with his still crippled hands, that always makes me cry. I think it's an extraordinarily moving piece, most of all.
Well, let's talk about the preparation for it, because not only was it epic in scale, it's complex in the way it's written. So when you're looking at the script, how far you can get your head around where you are in the story. But also there are key scenes. We saw it in the last episode when you recount the trauma of betraying the fellow pupil, and it's all in your telling of the story and your breakdown on screen with your therapist. It's very powerful. How was that preparation done?
Well, I did it day by day. As Jon will tell you, every morning he'd tell me what to do and take me through it quite cleverly, and I would spend that day doing it like that. It was so vast in my mind, so long and complicated, that I couldn't cope with it. So Jon just every morning would help me through it.
Logistically, we had a great advantage, which I don't think you'd get now. I mean, not long before I did that film, Singing Detective, I did a film with Mike Leigh. As you know, Mike Leigh is extremely demanding on the time he wants to employ actors to research the characters and all that sort of thing. We didn't quite have that, but we did build into the routine of shooting it an extraordinary, by today's standards, luxurious situation, which was we would film, and then we would stop filming, we'd have 2 or 3 weeks rehearsal. And that was actually planned from the beginning, and it meant that the solidity of the performances once we went filming had two advantages. We worked faster, and also we worked with more kind of possibility of enriching it still further, because people knew it in the way that they would know it almost if they were doing it for the stage.
Jon, what are your memories of how you tackled it? I'm particularly struck by what it must have looked like on the page when there's so much interweaving of these different timelines and worlds, and how then you approached it directing it.
You know, Dennis's script was an astonishing template, and whenever I was in doubt, I'd just go back to the script and look. Dennis would not say, close up on this or wide shot on this a lot of the time in the script, but he would describe, for example, a bit of black flecked spittle hissing on the grate in the miner's cottage with such detail that you knew it absolutely had to be a close-up. So trusting the script, especially once Dennis and I'd really worked quite hard on it, was the first thing. And oddly, as intimidated as I was when I first read the script, and as scared as I was before I started, there was a kind of joyfulness, and I think Michael and Janet can both, and Ken can all bear witness to this. There was a sort of joyfulness in the execution of it that carried us all in front of it, really. I think we all felt we were doing really good work. I think most of us felt that nobody was ever going to see it anyway. I mean, apart from people with a keen interest in dermatology and I mean, I thought, honestly, who the is going to see this stuff? Nobody. I mean, it's complicated. This guy's ranting at the screen. It jumps all over the place. And so there was a kind of wonderful abandon that I think all of us made it with. We made exactly the show we wanted to make, with the great confidence that probably no one was going to see it, and therefore it was down to us to play as hard, as creatively, as seriously as we could, and have fun doing it.
I remember, Jon, you coming up to me early one morning and asking me if I thought it was any good. Do you think this is any good?
I'm so glad I was spared that at the time, because I didn't understand. I thought we were making the usual masterpiece that Dennis told me we were making whenever he delivered a new script. So this must have been actor and director's talk.
Oh, but
so
you
measurable.
smell something good.
Yeah.
It wafted up at you.
What was
Good
your
stuff?
What was your relationship like with Dennis working on that?
He didn't have a relationship with me at all. He sat in a corner and glowered a lot. But maybe he was in pain. I don't know, but he wasn't a chatty, going around person at all. No.
He didn't talk to me much. I watched his hands all the time.
Yeah. Yes.
That's why I copied the.
He was crumpled up in his own life, really.
He said, "You never talk to me, do you?" I said, "No, I'm frightened of you." And he said, "Well, what are you interested in?" I said, "I like cars." So every day after that, he'd say, "Have you seen the new Ferrari, Michael?"
But the idea that you might get from what Michael just said, that Dennis sat in the corner every day docilely, waiting to see how it worked, it was never like that. He could not come very often, either because he was writing something else or because he was unwell. But when he was needed, he turned up and solved the problems, and I think gave himself to it fully.
Yes, but
Yeah.
with you, not with the actors. So there was a solving corners, I think.
Yes, but but if need be, he did know how directly to speak to actors.
Yeah, yeah.
John, you were going to say something.
Yeah, the only time that he came into rehearsal was kind of quietly disastrous in its way. You know, Michael doesn't like to talk much about stuff. So with Michael and me, I'd always just go and say, you know, just do it again, Michael, or do it a bit louder, or
Do it better.
yeah, do it better. With Patrick Malahide, you know, who's playing 3 different characters, he created this incredibly detailed topographical map for each of the characters and how each one was differentiated. And he and I would spend hours and hours and hours patiently talking about it. Dennis finally came to a rehearsal, and we did a scene. Patrick finally turned to Dennis with a sort of slight quaver in his voice and said, so what did you think? And Dennis went, well, it's really very simple. You know, you just got to remember you're just a figment of somebody's imagination. And I've never seen an actor actually physically implode at that particular
I think there was an occasion when a dermatologist was invited by the production to come and check out the look of Michael's makeup, and that was also happened to be a day when Dennis turned up. And the dermatologist came into the ward set, looked around, and headed straight away for Dennis, not Michael, because he spotted the real thing.
When Michael was first wheeled into the set after, how long was it, Michael? Like 6 hours for the full body makeup.
Oh,
6 hours.
long time.
Yeah, I think it was 6 hours in makeup. I mean, it required the patience of Joe.
And I was naked, wasn't I? Naked as well.
I wasn't going to tell people about that.
Right.
I've been trying to forget that part. Dennis was wheeled onto the set for the first time in that makeup, and literally the entire crew just went, oh. We were so deeply shocked at the state of him. There was this sort of respectful, melancholy silence that was finally broken by Michael saying, what's all this fuss about Chernobyl? I said, I went there.
That's right.
From that moment on, you know, I think we were all pretty comfortable.
Yeah.
Janet, I wanted to ask about that scene that we saw in the 6th episode when there's the exchange over the script and that person says to you, aren't you a bit old? And there's something to me that cuts through of Dennis Potter's personal, I don't know what's the right word, a bit of vitriol. I mean, you make the scene yours and it's so brilliant. But I wondered how you felt about the whole nature of that moment.
There's part of me that thought he was mocking actors and what they have to do, what they have to get up to, in a way. But in a dramatic way, it's perfectly legitimate to do that. But of course, as an actor, you want to find the heart of the beast a little bit, you know, so I had to find her hurt, really. But, you know, I just thought it was it was difficult to play because it's difficult to play figments sometimes.
Yes.
You have to find some fleshly equivalent to the figment in your imagination, and it can be a little bit tricky. But you hope you fool people well enough.
But I mean, I think that Dennis had an ability, which is almost Shakespearean or Keatsian, or as Keats coined this phrase about negative capability, but able to see into the heart of another human being whose experience is nothing like yours. So the number of times people have said to me, even, you know, about this character, you know, young women saying they identify with Michael's character, and you know, older people saying they identify with Bob Hoskins in Pennies from Heaven. And the phrase that got used more often than not was, he knows what I think. And that's an extraordinarily kind of strange gift, which I can't really identify in any other writer quite that I've worked with.
Can I ask about the lip-syncing, and Peter first, because you've used a device like that in Blackpool, but it's the thing everyone remembers about Dennis Potter, and yet it's when it is used, you always think of Dennis Potter too. I wonder what you think of how it was used here, and indeed the legacy of particularly that aspect of the singing detective in Pennies from Heaven.
Well, I think first, I mean, I don't know if Ken would agree. It almost, that particular device, for want of a better word, finds it's almost its perfect expression in Singing Detective. Watching Pennies from Heaven again, which I adore because it was the first Potter I ever saw, and I remember thinking when Bob Hoskins opened his mouth and it was Al Bowley's voice came out, thinking...
No, it's a woman's voice.
It's
That's
right. Thinking, are they allowed to do that? I remember thinking as a 14-year-old, surely that's not allowed.
I can tell you it was not allowed. We just did it. We just did it. And well, we don't want to dwell on Pennies from Heaven, but it's the fact that the next morning I was rang up by the head of music who said, you gave my assistant a bad time last night. And I said, in panic, I wasn't aware I was out with your assistant last night. I managed to dissipate the whole thing. And with the assistant of EMI, who wanted to put out a lot of LPs, we were able to say, it's not miming, it's just singing along. And we got away with it. But there was a minor payoff 10 years later with Singing Detective, where we were obliged to recreate 2 or 3 particular songs that John will remember, and exactly note for note, in order to employ in a regulation way just a fraction of the musicians we should have employed on Pennies from Heaven, but we got away with it in both occasions.
Peter, you were going to...
But I think, Dem Bones takes your breath away, and it's also completely works in story terms. Again and again, the music in Singing Detective pushes the story on. It's absolutely organic. You can't imagine a better way of telling this story. And I think that's when you're creating something, you're always looking for that. And I can't see a better way of expressing that particular story than the way you use music throughout the soundtrack, and those old songs faded and came in again.
How was it for you, Michael, performing them? Because you seem to be having such a wonderful time when you're singing.
Well, you just have to get the lips right and move properly. And when I'm in the hall there and singing that song, I did it quite well, didn't I? But it was a hell of a lot of work, and he just kept his eye on me all the time. John kept telling me off, and eventually I got it right.
It wasn't fun then, because it looks like you were having so much fun.
But it's fun, but it's also terrifying. If you're singing and you can't sing, it's a bit of a problem, isn't it? So you have to stick very closely to what you're told to do.
Did you love also getting into that, even though it was a part within a part of being the detective?
Yeah, I like wearing the suit and walking properly and doing all the things he did, as opposed to lying in the bed, So I was playing another part there, wasn't I think. John told me that. He told me everything. So,
but there's an interesting thing about Dem Bones, which John would probably like to talk about, which is that Dennis used to leave rather blank spaces in terms of encouraging the director and all the other people involved, all the other talents involved, how to do it. And that was particularly true of Dem Bones, where he didn't really give any hints at all, just the song, and here we are, and it comes out of what it comes out of, and we go into whatever we go into. And the amount of autonomy, creative autonomy, which John and the rest of the team were allowed to exercise over that was extraordinary, wasn't
John,
it?
tell us about that song and indeed the other numbers.
Well, when you guys were talking earlier about favourite sequences, I would have to number Dem Bones among my favourites, probably because it scared the knickers off me to do it. I'd never done anything like it before. As Ken said, there was no real guide in the script to how to do it. And so basically with Quinny Sachs, the choreographer, and Jim Clay, the production designer, we spent hours and hours and hours brainstorming about ways in which we could actually do this. And gradually, what emerged was to me utterly delightful. The way in which we blended the hospital with the seedy dive bar that we'd seen earlier, the way in which elements of the story that were going to come further down the line or started to leak in. Even the way in which the curtains of the hospital booth became the beaded curtains of the nightclub. The adorable, divine Joanne Wally doing French can-can, I think it's a memory that every red-blooded male will remember. it was just one of those sequences that I think ultimately just by dint of a vast amount of work came together.
And we shot it for a number of days, didn't we?
Yeah, did we? I mean,
I think
thought
3 or
it was
4.
Really?
And we were able
I
to,
thought
yeah.
it was much less. I remember it as just being one of those sort of like tremendous, like go, 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 go kind of days. But maybe it was more. Memory is a strange thing for sure. But all the musical sequences, I adored a couple of the preacher singing, for example, in episode 5. I thought just absolute Simon Chandler was just absolutely wonderful in that. And then, you know what was extraordinary about Dennis, who in a sense used the songs as elevator shafts. You know, the songs were these elevator shafts that traveled between the 4 levels. This was the way I used to think of it anyway, of the story. You know, with the 4 levels being memory of childhood, the singing detective story, fiction set in the past, the present day, and then that sort of 4th floor attic where all 3 of those elements collided in the sort of hallucinating mind of the singing detective. So the songs, you know, once I started to think about them as those things that were ferrying us between those different levels, their function started to feel much clearer and stronger for me. And Dennis's response to every one of those songs, they were always specific recordings, was so extraordinary. I mean, I don't think anybody could have listened to Al Jolson singing After You've Gone and thought that was a creepy, sinister song. Clearly, young Dennis Potter did, and by the time that song appears, sung by the Scarecrow, played by Janet Hemfrey, the teacher, you know, it becomes so deeply terrifying. And one, you know, it's hard to imagine anybody else ever having listened to that song in quite the way Dennis did.
Well, let's talk about the reaction to the show, both at the time and the kind of long-term legacy. If you look at the DVD box set of it, they've got the points of view with Barry Took, and there are actually retired colonels writing in to express their extreme disgust and giving very detailed descriptions of all these lewd things they can see on screen. At the time, were you aware of this kind of row over it, or did you just walk away and leave it?
A lot of words of rumpy pumpy went around one day.
But I mean, it wasn't the biggest row by any means that I was involved in over a Dennis Potter piece. It wasn't banned, it wasn't censored, and it lived. But the crisis, which is of a different order, was that it started out with, I think, 8 or 9 million, and then dipped a bit in 2, and in 3, by the time we got to 3, somebody decided they had to do something about this, and somebody did. And the Sunday that 3 was going to appear, there was a very lurid story in one of the Sunday tabloids about the scene of the boy watching his mother and her lover make love below, which of course completely falsify the actual filming conditions. The boy wasn't there when they were doing it. And I can say now with some pride, and not that the person who prompted that story was one Dennis Potter, you know, and it had the effect. The audience went up again and it kind of stayed up, you know. So, I mean, he was such a gift to an organisation, to a producer, because he had so many incidental gifts, which, you know, the kind of writers which one tended to work with who were too shy to come to their own previews. Dennis was absolutely the other extreme.
Michael, how did you feel about the row at the time? And given that it's something that's regarded as one of the greatest thing in television by people like Stephen King, and you
What was the row?
Well, the row was about the sex. It was about the...
Oh, they're just all silly, aren't they? All that.
But were you aware of it at the time?
No, I wasn't.
So,
aware of it.
John?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I have to give a big sort of hats off to Michael Grade, who, when he saw episode 3, called Ken and I up to his office and started with the absolute bone-chilling words, "Listen, guys, obviously I want to save as much of this episode as I can." That's how he started out. And after 45 minutes of impassioned advocacy from Ken and me. To his enormous credit, he went, all right, I get it, fuck it, let's print it. So, you know, I was enormously impressed by his willingness to take the chance on that. And the interesting thing was that at the time, Margaret Thatcher was busy bashing the BBC for her own political interests. She'd made an alliance with Rupert Murdoch, who needed to advance his interests in BSB and Sky, that Thatcher allowed to merge quite inappropriately. And so what they collectively did was embark on a little BBC bashing a campaign based on episode 3, which came out almost unnoticed until I think Mary Whitehouse got involved briefly, didn't she, Ken?
She did.
But I think it was BBC in News Sex Shocker was the headline I remember, and that really simply, for purely political reasons, fomented a whole false sort of scandal about that particular episode and about the series in general.
Right. Do you think it could have been made now? I mean, that's an inevitable question, is, you know, what's the state of TV writing and commissioning? I mean, Peter, do you want to take that first?
Well, I'm always a little suspicious of that as a question, because it happened, you know, Dennis was such a one-off. It happened when it happened. You know, the timing of the project, and we should all be grateful that it exists. I think if we're talking about could it happen now in terms of budgetary, then maybe in a co-production something of that scale could happen. If you're asking if the dominant, and it was when Dennis Potter was writing as well, you know, the dominant television tradition has always been realism and naturalism, which Dennis wasn't. And so you know, it's a good naturalism, as I know, is an easy default position. I think the impact is more in terms of ambition for drama. I think his inspiration was on a generation of writers who were ambitious with material. What they've made might not look like Singing Detective, but for instance, just this year, say episode 6 of Cucumber by Russell T Davies was an extraordinarily audacious hour of television, telling an extraordinarily brave and exposing story. So I think if you're asking about budget, I think because of the co-productions at the moment that are around with the likes of Netflix and ironically Sky Atlantic, you probably could fund something like this, because that was always an issue. I think for years that couldn't have happened.
It's the artistic risk of commissioning it.
Sorry?
The artistic risk for the commissioners and taking it on. I was trying to imagine the BBC now commissioning something
The Honourable
like
Woman
this.
strikes me as quite a big, risky piece, and that was
BBC
made.
too, yeah. I mean, my sense is that the inner purpose of broadcast television has changed, and certainly up to that period and a little bit beyond, you could count or hope, if you were clever, that the people who put up the money for you to make your shows would have what somebody got, I think it was Tony Garnett, said, we want to give them the courage of our convictions. Now, when Tony said that, he was talking more about kind of, obviously left-wing material, but it was the case that they would back difficult stuff, particularly if it was headlined by a writer with some reputation, because their own survival partly depended upon it. I don't think that happens anymore, because what we now have is a BBC which is transformed in the collective will it has at the top of its pinnacle, and a government which at the moment is determined, I think, not to destroy it, but to chip away as much as it can. And we don't have any Dennis Potters. So I think it's very, I don't want to be too pessimistic, it's dubious. There is still brave stuff that goes on, but I think the whole willpower and a steamroller determination of the people who organise broadcasting is very, very much changed. But with Dennis, you always have that he would be the irresistible force if somebody else was the irresistible object, and he would push. But it's clear a little bit that, even not taking too much account of his final illness, that some power disappeared a little. The Singing Detective was the peak. The things that came after were still Dennis, but they weren't that peak.
Janet, how do you look back on the experience of this? And indeed, whether you think there's writing that good on that scale, you know, that ambition.
The answer to your second part is no, I haven't seen any like this, because my impression as I'm listening to everybody looking back on this great work, I'm wondering why it's so great. And I think it's because he broke so many rules, or expectations really of what television can or can't do. There's something so fluid and filmic. You know, sometimes you think of The Third Man, or, you know, film noir, and he reminds you of the big screen at the same time as it's on the small screen. And I think the breadth of that visual vision is absolutely astonishing. I was blown away by it when even just to see bits of it. There's a kind of malleability and size of imagination there which is not usual at all. I think it's quite extraordinary.
What about for you, Michael?
Oh, me, I just thank God I was in it. Because I'm very privileged and lucky.
I think God thanks you for being in it.
I love it.
Yeah.
And Joanne Wally, of course, I quite like her. You know what I mean? I tried it, but no luck. That's all.
Because the thing that everyone parodies is the greasing scene, don't they? And
The greasing's good.
And I just wondered. I did wonder. Did you have to rehearse that as well?
No, we rehearsed it 10 times. We just went through it, you know, to check it was all right. You have to do that. You daren't risk doing it once.
John.
I was just going to add to what Ken was saying, which I would have agreed with entirely, you know, up to a year or two ago. But I think the landscape has changed rather. As much as I would have said that nobody would ever make The Singing Detective again, and if they did, they would make it in such a circumscribed way with so many caveats and cautions and anxieties that it probably would barely be recognizable. I used to feel that was very true. I totally agree with what Ken said about the decline of public broadcasting, but there is, a whole new modality really in television at the moment. Which I think is encouraging incredibly bold original voices. B, which has brought back the miniseries as a commercially viable and creatively credible form. And C, you know, especially among the Netflix, HBOs, Showtimes, and some of the other premium cable stations, is encouraging of risk and of outrage, because in a sense that's where they're getting their profile from, by doing bold, brave, rule-breaking work. So, you know, I don't see anything like The Singing Detective. I don't see anything with the sort of formal originality of that. But I do think there's an extraordinary wealth of great original television coming out that I think can lay claim to greatness. I think we're lucky to be living through this particular period in television.